Hello, welcome back to the channel. I wanted to revisit some topics that I've talked about in the course of many videos. Generally, I avoid politics, and by that I mean modern, prefabricated politics. You know, you have Coke or Pepsi, you have this alternate retelling of history or this rewritten of history. You know, I'm avoiding all that. I'd like to think that I've been focusing on what you would call the politics and the philosophy of poetry or literature. Because if you recall, the poets were banished a long time ago in favor of a more linear, yet runs the risk of delusional line of thinking, which has shaped all of human history and arguably warped the minds of an entire species. But I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here. I was thinking specifically, I've been reading a lot of both Marshal McLuhan and Terrance McKenna lately, of all people, but where they had their fingers on the pulse was exactly where no one else did, which is no different than contemporary society. Everyone's going, "Meh, meh, 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 meh." Nobody listens, and no one knows where they're at, where they're going, or why. I would say, if I believed in the notion of a dark age, I would say this is a dark age. And by that, I mean the people are changing before they know it, and they don't know where they're going or why, which brings me to what I was thinking is the kind of central thought and theme of this video, which is the denial at the heart of Western culture. Because if you go from McLuhan informing everyone, hey, we're going to be going towards a torn apart tribal model, to McKenna saying, hey, we're approaching the end of history. And yes, it's Hegelian. Yes, he said God is dead before Nietzsche did. Yes, you could extrapolate that politics is dead, that history is dead, that philosophy is dead, that a lot of things have died. So by the time you get to more contemporary philosophy, let's say a book like Peter Sloterdijk's, what is it? Sorry for butchering the name, but Infinite Mobilization, again, it's for every generation to awake anew and see where we're at. And as much as I love McKenna, he was another one where is coherent as he truly was, and as much as I thought his predictive model of the future was right on time, and that people still don't know what happened, why it happened, how it happened, or what that means for contemporary humanity, that the whole culture is in denial of all this because it has to assume the trappings that history is still happening, that things are still happening, when in fact it's not. It's just basically, if you could think of modern civilization being Kafkaesque, Orwell-esque, that Thomas More-esque, Marx-esque, like there are all these elements that are alive and well in contemporary Western culture, but the notion of the ideological wave that's going to sweep, or the revolution like Krusty's going to get here, that any of these things were going to be a solution or fix anything by the people, especially who have, the premise was, well, all the people with nothing to lose will eventually do something. And what you can see is it's just not the case, because culture is the protective nursery. So, most people never leave that. They really do remain, we are a neotenous species. We are a very juvenile culture, especially here in America. I'd say the West generally. To me, the species looks pretty neat. Like, never mind. We're getting into human evolution now. I don't want to digress. But back to, McKenna's vision is that he was right. Yet he does the same thing perennially that every liberal does. Is that the wealthy white liberal, they get their piece of the pie, and then they go, oh great, we have this power. How can we keep it out of other people's hands? And how do we kick out the ladder? So in case nobody knows this, he was there at the head of the tech wave, encouraging people to take LSD, to go further inwards. McLuhan already said we were a psychedelic culture by way of TV, because the user becomes the medium. If you don't know what that means, that's the manipulation, that's the advertising, that's the programming. We had a culture, people think technology is the problem, but let me clear this up. Technology doesn't affect you could put it like this: technology doesn't drive or affect our behavior, the environment does. So you see, it's a system of relations. And I'm just quoting McLuhan. People can argue and reframe this all they want, it doesn't matter. Framing a picture here, right? So uh, McLuhan is seeing the psychedelic culture heading inwards towards fragmentation and tribal warfare. a few decades later, or and simultaneously, actually, McKenna's having his revelations about the time wave zero, the end of history, and the full-on, embracing of a psychedelic culture, that it does revert to tribalism in both its behavior, its expressions, and, what he avoided most, because I doubt it would sell well to his audience, was as much as he criticized the violence of American culture, both psychological and overt, a bunch of the kind of insecurity it breeds and creates, is that his criticism was, that it had taken us to the end of the road and it's not going to go any further. And so he predicted and prescribed to the idea of dematerializing the world, meaning, hey, the future isn't going to be about products and goods, it's going to be about services and experiences and objects you don't own, to which, people react violently, because when our whole identity is wrapped up in who has the most, who makes the most, and it doesn't matter, because a lot of people, it's like they have all the outer trappings, but they're still either miserable, they're still either a husk of a human being, or they still can't get laid or married, or they still can't do the things they want. So the idea that we only focus on the external as any sort of symbol or reference point, because it's the only thing that everyone can see. And this is the most hilarious thing, right? Because intelligent people can see inwardly. Some people, they can only see outwardly. So the world is only what authorities tell them, right? They can't actually derive their own internal values. They can't examine things for themselves. I think a recent study said something like 80% of people, um, they can't say no to authority. Generally, if someone tells them what to do or whatever it is, it doesn't matter whether they agree or not, they just can't help it, right? So it seems to me that, thousands of years of civilizational training, constantly killing off the rebellious and the mean and the strong, and all these wars being fought, has been a constant culling. And civilization isn't for the civilized, it's for the survivors, right? So coming to where we're at, it's been this infinite mobilization, this infinite culling process of constantly making turns and going in circles and going in circles, all to arrive here in the future to whatever was drawing us, where McLuhan pointed out just a few short years ago, because remember, it's a light speed culture, a psychedelic culture, and at light speed, everything collapses. So now that everyone is here, now that everyone's aware of the global village, now everyone's seeing everything happening at once, and I'm not saying that this is literally the case. It's about the psychedelic cultural landscape that modern media has created. And at the heart of this, again, I'm saying is a denial. The denial is the need to keep the system going, which is to continue for, like, there's a lot of people, the most they can do is work, and everyone else feeds on them. On the furthest end of the scale, most billions of people are making 50 cents a day. So a handful more people can make $7 an hour. So a handful of people can take everything else, right? It's just the way it's been for a long time, and everyone just agrees that that's the way it is. So here we are, we've arrived, again, light speed, where's there to go? There's this denial and there's this notion of, hey, come be a part of this. And then you could say, part of what? This culture was being blown out decades ago. It's been blowout after blowout, each new technology reflecting the blowout, and then the violent cultural response reflecting the technology, which only changes the environment, which is what they're reacting to, because humanity has always existed in context of their environment. They've never been free of those material factors. We just happen to be born there, right? So the idea that anyone is guilty in this is absurd. Everyone's innocent. Doesn't mean they're not dangerous. It doesn't mean they won't destroy you, because it happens every day and has for all of history. I'm just pointing out that everyone's innocent here. They had no more say in how the dice rolled than anyone else. But I'm trying to drive home a point that there's this denial, both of the ending of history, of the death of God, of the death of community, of the retribalizing of civilization. See, this is where I think everyone's wrong. Everyone keeps going, gee, we're coming apart. Gee, what's happening? Gee, people are losing their minds. It's like, what makes you assume they ever had their minds? How would you even characterize their mind? What made you think anything was ever united to begin with, right? The idea is that uh, Christianity gave civilization and man, and gave Eros, and by proxy, civilization and man, poison to drink. Eros is a god, though, like Logos. So Eros didn't die, but it degenerated to vice, meaning the very same things that formerly bound man has degenerated and disappeared as an infinite vanishing point. If you don't understand that, I mean, people can't live by their virtues, their values, or their morals. They're stuck being ground down and exploited and utilized within a system. And I don't mean that. I just mean in the way that you could ask any American man, hey, do you think you're overtaxed? Do you think you pay for more than your fair share of the stupidity and the decadence and the degeneration around here, right? The way people conceive it. And look, you could, in a certain sense, you could say civilization has been going downhill for 25,000 years, ever since people started putting people to the sword and saying, you're part of us now. It's been going downhill ever since then, because turns out, tribes had their place, people had their homes, and being forced to live and operate and think in a certain way, it wasn't what you thought it was, because you missed out on what those people were really thinking, right? All the accounting that's only been recently done in history was so in philosophy, with so much more to be done. The history of madness, the history of clinical reason, because the simplistic Western model that is taught is, you know like formerly the world was insane. They didn't know what they were doing. It's like, no, they had very particular rationale. Just like I mentioned the politics of poetry, they had their very real politics. And again, it brought us to the furthest incarnation of what civilization could be, which is a bunch of tribes loosely connected with violence, which was just a big long circle from where we began. So if that was the height and rise, and that process took thousands of years, then the fall will technically take likely thousands of years, if that's what these bigger patterns and cycles are. There's been so much hot and contemporary literature written on this stuff, like the fourth turning, and it's become very vogue. And I think it is, there's a lot of people cashing in, because this gets to my criticism of the denial of the culture, is that no one takes it seriously. It's just a grounds for them to make a living, because that they reveal to you that there's nothing there. Again, you can keep telling people, come be a part of this. No young, healthy, vital American man wanted to be one of Kafka or Orwell's bugmen in a system that exploits them and doesn't compensate them, can't promise them anything but a slow decline that they have to pay for. So again, what I see being sold from what's created from the young to the older, it's just feeding on men's desperation, and it's really disheartening and really disgusting. And I think it's fostering weakness, because it's the most know-nothing authorities, non-existent authorities. It's a bunch of contemporary nonsense that holds no weight in the history of philosophy, poetry, literature, culture. There's this idea I've talked about before, that there's no longer business left. It's busyness. It's keeping people occupied, right? If it's infinite mobilization with nowhere to go, that means keeping millions and billions of bodies busy, because you don't want to see what it looks like when they're not busy enough, or when they don't think there's a carrot on that stick. But when you can see that there's way more stick than carrot, and then you go a little bit further and see that there's no carrot, well, is where Peter, for instance, gets into interesting territory, talking about how that will shape and change the human psyche. What that might mean for the future, being that large amounts of the population would reach a certain level of what would formerly be called esoteric enlightenment, even though it might not take the forms. I mean, people don't understand this, I don't think, but like amongst monks, like you can be like Buddhist people who do pursue a spiritual path. It's like you can be an enlightened idiot. You really can. It's just you're not going to have any knowledge, and no one's going to ask you any questions, because you're not going to have any answers. But you're definitely existing in a space outside, right, removed from the normal concerns of physiology, right, which you can see in the West is a it's kind of like a motor of fear and passion. And there's, for everything I love about our culture specifically, that exists to produce art, and that's about it, because the truth of it being in the pessimism, in the depression of the culture, in the nihilism, that again, no one's to blame for. This is historical. This is unprecedented. And that we have a market and a government and a history full of, a majority of, I don't want to say idiots, but just the ignorant, constantly reassuring you with nonsense. And then it falls lower. And then just when you think it can't get any worse or lower, it will, and it does, right? So the denial at the heart of Western culture is a denial of the warped psyche of the Western person, right? That they can't take the exploitation and good nature, that they become mad, that they become incensed, that they, that it literally, I think our culture does drive people crazy. I think it's going to be, if I wanted to tell you the future, because as McLuhan says, the future of the future is the present. Imagine maybe it'll take a couple hundred years to become this desperate, but imagine a post-political, post-moral world. Everyone and everything's been, well, I already told you in the past, or shared in the past, that everything's been robbed and devalued, right? Including our highest arts and art forms and our very humanhood itself and any notion of dignity therein. But if you can imagine something like needing large fenced in areas, not for political enemies, not for even prisoners, just to go, hey, we have so many homeless and insane people who can no longer fit into this super sophisticated technological model that has rendered these people removed from their environment. They have no environment. There's nowhere they can be. They're not allowed to exist, right? Because, I don't know, they're not, because here's the interesting thing about the denial, right? That on the low end of the scale of intelligence, you don't have to expect much. People are just, they have to believe what their culture tells them. They've been taught to think and what to think about thinking. And then also that, they can't move beyond that because that's the safety net and everything else is chaos and scary beyond there. And then the more sophisticated are more double-faced, right? In the sense that, I just mean that, you educate man, you make him more subtle is all, because, right, if overt violence is still in the lockdown, you just make them more subtle, more sophisticated. And that's kind of what I think the evolutionary arms race and the real species divide in our species has been. But that's all obfuscated. We can't even talk about that, even though it's scientific and related to just DNA and genetics. It's like you can't even talk about that because it's basically illegal. And I'm not trying to be weird about it. I'm not trying to be stupid. I mean, it's illegal in the way that Darwin saying what he wanted to say and what he needed to say was illegal, right? That he saw the implications. He knew he couldn't say the whole theory. He saw that other people were also coming to the same conclusion around the same time. It's no different right now. There's other people coming to similar conclusion than me, with more or less education. It doesn't matter. But the more you see through your culture, the more you die to your culture, and the more they die to you, until you're just outside the bounds of what was formerly known. And I know this stuff is really, people make a big deal about ego death, but it's not that complicated, and it's not that, everyone who tries to bring you into a cult of personality, everyone who tries to say it has to be done this way, or this is the only safe way, or this is it's all the same fascistic tendency it's always been. A poisoned arrows trying to force people to tell them what to do. They want to ignore the fact that yes, we can't, yes, better, more intelligent human beings have been born and will be born, yet we're stuck, playing in the stupid ages because the average is so abysmal and dismal that the civilization will squander itself, infinitely mobilizing against itself to protect the average, to preserve the average. And yet, like I said, it's a dark age in the sense that, those people back in the TV days, they didn't know all the layoffs were coming. And then when AI was about to hit, people were worried about the layoffs, in this day. And it's just going to, and these stacking changes that are just rendering whole people and sectors and ways of thought and being obsolete, until again we're a global atomized psychedelic village who doesn't actually get to be a part of anything but only role plays in certain positions, right? This is the lie of the culture, that there's something to be a part of. No, we understand it to be role playing. We want it to be meaningful. This is what I've heard the kids saying for a long time. The existing human beings, it's like if we're going to have nothing, if we're stuck role playing in someone else's mediocre, boring, bland remnants of a dominator pirate system, then it should at least be meaningful. It should at least not be 100% pointless, miserable, and a lie, right? Or, in this old school philosophical sense, you would employ irony, which is a form of tyranny, which doubles into entendre, which is an hourglass that says time's up, right? That the cynicism gets us nowhere, irony gets us nowhere, the complaining gets us nowhere, but yet the denial also gets us nowhere, because everything gets us nowhere, because we've already arrived, and yet the system can only model its need, which is the environment, which is millions and billions of bodies supported by hustling and scamming and pirating and working, I get it, and contributing and giving. But the world is so ruthless and brutal, it's strangled out goodwill, arguably, right? This is reverting back to tribal warfare and limited resources and the elimination of nature or the environment itself. And man is just infinitely vanishing into the horizon. And again, everyone at the front of the culture, they're going to tell you what they need to tell you. They're going to lie to you. The media is going to keep lying. Everyone's going to do the song and dance because they have to. What are they going to do after investing a whole history worth of resources and dominance in a singular direction? You think anyone's going to change that now? And right, and everyone seems to agree. When you try and point out to people of a culture how insane they are, they usually can't see it, right? Because they think it's normal. So anyway, um, I'm just getting to a point here, and that's to say that the denial is the refusal to grow up, and the lie is that participating in a non-existent, bankrupt, role play, bleed you dry, make you pay for the destruction culture of squander and waste, like that old term potlatch, right? The hedging and this millenarian tradition of, oh no, it's the end of times. Oh no, it's the end of times. Oh, we got this far and it's not the end of times. We better start rewriting history, because these intelligent modern people aren't going to stomach this kind of leadership anymore, because they've already let the heads roll. And now leadership and responsibility has vanished as well, right? Because there's no community. There's no one to be held responsible. Occasionally someone goes to jail, but that's nothing. That's nothing out of millions and billions who are, again, doing everything they can to just scrape by and survive day to day, right? To endure, to procreate, which, the Western tradition is completely lost track of. People don't seem to understand, well, if the intelligent people make very few of themselves and the average make a lot of themselves, this is a problem forever. But the kind of false power dynamics within civilization, right, that assert certain things that just aren't true, like most everything that a culture can assert and does assert, right? You can see that in the Christian tradition, for instance, that if they could have kept the world wrapped up in the medieval ages forever and kept history in a stasis, they would have. People fight reality and change, flux, right? That you can never step into the same river twice. People fight that tooth and nail. And you can see that's part of what drives them insane. It's a refusal to grow up. It's a culture in denial. And again, a neotenous culture, an anti-intellectual culture at that, I don't think it can grow up, because the sheer need of and of the effects of living also in a very poisonous environment. Poisonous to the weak, poisonous to the strong. Formerly, it was the biggest life raft for the majority of the 85% proles who keep the place running, which is increasingly hostile to everyone. You can just see its increasing erosion. You can see it withering away. You can see everyone's fear of the end in all this. And I just wanted to revisit this and visit this period as a primer for this essay I'm writing. And I'll probably read it because I recognize with this sort of natural inclination, it's really hard for anyone to follow this kind of natural talk, because everyone's so used to, again, when I talk about the programming of TV and civilization, is what I mean. You guys have been programmed to think linearly. You've been programmed within very narrow bounds to follow point to point. And you can't actually make logical connections. So you're used to being told what to think. This is my issue. This is why it's hard to communicate. I don't want to say it's hard to communicate. I've actually, so you guys know, I have a lot of friends. I've known a lot of people. I've had no problem communicating with Americans. It's a question of what's the point thereof? What's the benefit thereof? Especially if you don't want or need anything from most all of them. But again, when I see that most of it just exists as primarily there's two classes of people, those who get fed on and those who feed on them. That's, I'm not trying to be crude or crass, but it is a crude and crass culture. And then formerly the art was serviced with a smile, so you could at least paper over the subjugation and the domination and the destruction of the human spirit and the poisoned eros and the weakness of this culture that's slowly keeps dissolving itself in itself, right? It's becoming, you probably say, increasingly acidic, and you see this in people's madness and their frustration and their inability to live, right? It's corrosive. And I think it's reflected in our physiology and in our health statistics, not just anything from suicide and drug abuse, but just the way of life and the poverty levels. And you can't actually make sense of it, but the joke of it in philosophy is you can. And the even bigger joke about philosophy is the craziest, most insane, least qualified people in the world, same joke as in religion, will follow someone else's idea thinking it's the right thing. Right? You got a copy of a copy following a copy thinking they know reality, right? Reality is gone. And you guys can keep trying to sell it. You can sell your self-improvement. You can sell men all these lies. But anything that isn't predicated on some notion of a real guiding post into the future, because you guys mostly keep living in the past. And just like the people who thought, like, oh, TV is not going to change things that much. Just like the telegraph didn't change anything, right? Just like all these other mediums that changed the world didn't change anything, right? No, it's changing the environment. So now, though, I think with everyone and everything arrived, there's no environment left to change, you could say, basically, except for the very few people who can actually afford to do that. Instead, the environment's going to further shape the individual, and in a psychotic, immature culture who can't handle its own complexes, its own psyche, its own ways of life, I think that means a lot of pathology. And maybe my hope is that the best thing that could happen in America is that anyone in the medical field or the scientific fields or any relevant field would increasingly realize what a big problem this is at present, how bad it's going to be for the future. Like this, you guys are still operating off models of like the Stone Age, right? You guys think it's about morality. You guys think it's about virtue. You guys don't even have those things. Those were someone else's idea that, this, by the time people are repeating it thousands of years later, that way of life and environment that pertained to is completely gone, you know, completely gone. You have bodies occupying spaces. These bodies are worth nothing, and they're infinitely interchangeable. And where they're worth something, they're milked for everything that can be got, and they're insured, but that's not a lot in most people's cases, or in civilization's average case, right? Which is to level all mountains and peaks. And again, in a post-eschatological world, I keep butchering that word, um, in this world, it means infinite covering your ass, infinite rewriting history. Oh, and when this model fails because it was again, all this, whether like within the religious traditions fall of like the success gospel in church, or the self-improvement right of a, like, it's not self-generated, it's an extroverted belief system that isn't instantiated anywhere in the world, so it has no environmental impact, right? These are the kinds of things I'm talking about, of why most of what our culture sells is completely irrelevant. It's bunkum, it's, what do you call it, placebos, right? And I'm not saying there's not truth in some of these things, but that it's not even internally derived, but externally sold as part of the problem. Right? My thing is helping people with their self-image. That's the difference. Pointing you back, going, hey, again, after being conditioned to be conditioned to think a certain way about thinking itself, you're never going to get out of that water. And that's kind of culture's point. It's not your friend. It's a net. It's meant to keep you there. And you can see that within civilization, it's only ever violence that's ever changed or forced anyone's hands. And whether that's psychological, right, in the case of philosophy, because I think there's a lot of people who might be overreacting right now as a symptom of morbidity and decline, for instance, rather than just, again, they're not accustomed to an intellectual culture. They're not accustomed to free and open, non-scripted communications, right? This is what makes, when I said communicating with Americans is hard, it's because they're on scripts. Most people here are on scripts. The actors are on scripts. The non-actors are on scripts. You can watch the theater, right? There's a lot better theater than what's on offer on TV, but that's the psychedelic world, and I'm just trying to bring a semblance of where is reality at back to realities and finishing infinite vanishing point. Um, anyway, I'm kind of rolling my words here. Mouth is getting dry. I've been rambling on for a minute. I'm trying to decide where I want to go with this content in relation to this subject matter, because I recognize that if people don't see a utility in something, it's basically invisible, which is why uh, creativity is still not understood. It's why genius still isn't understood. It's why people are constantly copying the people who can see inwardly, the people who can see creatively and create creatively. That's why people copy them for all eternity, back to our present model, right? And the question then, well, is there anything more that can be said or done? And it's like, to my mind, if it doesn't contribute towards spiritual enlightenment, it's just fake. It's false. It's just more people selling stuff because they need to survive. I've talked about this before. The whole of this society, as much as I love parts about America and American culture, it's like the whole of it is busy work. I get it. A lot of people need jobs. A lot of people need to live, but that we're wrapped up in such mediocre service, lackluster performances, bad attitudes, right? And I get it. It's not their fault. Like, they are victims as much as they are symptoms of the culture. And I don't mean that lightly in the way that people use the V word in politics, right? Because we're talking about the politics of poetry. But, as much as people want to, as much as Plato tried to banish the poets, turns out they never went anywhere. And that uh, thousands of years of a particularly a single perception and line of thoughts conditioning, turns out there's a million and billions of perspectives and millions and billions more, because the very notion of platonic forms, like I talked about with irony turning into the hourglass of uh, double entendre and oxymoron, is that the forms just infinitely multiply. So there's infinite delusions on offer. So it's always a question of what resonates with people. And I don't want to put this forward in a defeatist attitude. I want to put it forward in a way of, hey, if this is the environment, know what you're navigating. And it's true that in this environment, image still remains everything. That hasn't changed, and I don't think that will ever change, because just as real power is real power, the symbols of power stay real power, at least as symbols. Anyway, if you're new to the channel or just returning, thanks for taking the time. I'll see about writing this other essay. I have more King in Yellow to record, and then I'm going to get back to, I think, some songs and other content. But from there, I just want to thank you again for your time. Say welcome back, and I will catch you next time. Take care.